Fernando Alonso returned to the F1 paddock after one of the most mysterious absences there's ever been. Alonso had missed the season opener in Australia while recovering from his strange crash in testing, where his car had veered into the wall, exiting Barcelona's fast turn 3, and he suffered a concussion. If you weren't following F1 in 2015 and you're wondering why this is so mysterious, it's because there was never a clear explanation given for what caused the crash, and McLaren hadn't helped matters early on with some mixed messaging around if Alonso was injured or not. But we'll focus purely on his return to the paddock. Frankly, I think I know I say this a lot, we could do a whole episode from test crash to this moment, but we're just going to focus on he's back in the paddock. Before the weekend, he gave his theory on what caused the crash. He felt it was caused by a steering problem, saying even though he lost consciousness in the helicopter on the way to the hospital, he remembered everything about the accident. He said the steering had locked in turn 3, sending him into the inside wall, but he'd managed to brake and downshift from 5th gear to 3rd before the impact. However, he said there was not a clear answer in the data McLaren had about the crash, and he suggested McLaren's data acquisition in that area of the car was not at the top during testing, but they'd added more sensors to the car since then. Ben, what was it like trying to get to the bottom of this bizarre story? We've got the excitement of, yay, Fernando's back, but we've also got this still, what the hell actually happened going on in the background?
I don't think anyone really knows. It was the most difficult story to chase because the team was contradicting the driver was contradicting the team was contradicting itself. You had the medical sensitivity over it because Alonso was concussed. The fuzzy memory he had because he tried to deny that he'd had that retrograde amnesia that you can get when you have concussions, and that he felt that he'd woken up or regained consciousness and thought he was a 9-year-old karting version of Fernando Alonso rather than the one consigned to the McLaren-Honda misery, and all that stuff came back. But yet he remembered bits about the accident that tallied, and then there were conflicting reports about like the team blaming wind. And then Alonso saying, oh yeah, but even a hurricane couldn't have blown me off track at that speed, but he was going faster than at any point in testing so far. So it was a complete mess, and it wasn't helped by there being no onboard footage. There was CCTV, I believe, but it was never released. And you had Ron Dennis wading in as well, which is fun, but it did not help.
Though, did it?
Did not help give us clarity. And filling the gaps, in fairness, okay, it was a weird situation. McLaren created a lot of the gaps in the knowledge, and those were filled with conspiracy theories about Alonso having some kind of medical event in the car before he crashed, that he was electrocuted by the car, and that's why he crashed. And Ron, I remember famously in the pre-season test, when he came in to deliver his press conference about Fernando, the situation, and that Kevin Magnussen would drive probably if Fernando wasn't fit. I can categorically rule out electrification, which is stuck in my mind more than actually being at the 2015 Malaysian Grand Prix. And Dennis also tried to claim that Alonso hadn't had a concussion, that he displayed concussion symptoms, but there was nothing medically wrong with him, and that just wasn't true. So you had complete mess. Dennis saying one thing, Eric Boulier, who was racing director, saying no, there was a concussion. The team saying there was nothing wrong with the car. Alonso saying there was something wrong with the steering. So basically nobody knew what was going on.
It was one of those things where I always remember how rampant the conspiracy theories were. I remember being at the Australian Grand Prix. I do remember being there the race before and wandering down Fitzroy Street, which is kind of adjacent to the track in St Kilda. And I ran into one well-known journalist, who I won't name, who said, oh no, he's never going to race in Formula One again. This was really serious. There was some electrification, etc. It wasn't Ron Dennis, even though that word may have been used.
Categorically ruled out.
Yeah, but that was the extent to which it was going on. Everyone was running around saying, oh, it's this, it's this, it's this. I think when you boil down to it, there was unquestionably a concussion. I think, as is often the case, there's a lot of failure to understand what a concussion is and how serious it is. People sometimes conflate it with unconsciousness, and it's slightly different to that. They come up with all sorts of reasons why, we missed a race, therefore it must have been more serious. Well, a concussion is pretty serious. A secondary concussion can be enormously serious. So there was that, all of what McLaren were doing, all of these theories, etc., etc. It's so rare, actually, for something like this to happen, because even at testing these days, there's so much coverage and stuff going on that this was quite an old school kind of thing, wasn't it, in terms of the conspiracy theories and what was going on. I think we can be sure there was a concussion. Alonso may have played down the seriousness. I did, to remind myself, watch the video of the press conference on Thursday, which he was in, just to remind myself, and there were lots of questions there. So maybe he downplayed it a little bit because he didn't want any question marks over his fitness, and McLaren obviously were doing what they were doing. So it was, I think, there at its heart, there was a bit of a failure in terms of the communications at McLaren, particularly from what Ron Dennis said, that just made it look a lot more than it actually was. Because sometimes a car hits a wall and a driver gets concussed. It does happen. Although I think we'll never quite understand exactly what that phenomenon Alonso was talking about with the steering not working. And it's not impossible that he momentarily blacked out, because my understanding of when there have been cases of drivers blacking out, they do kind of have that feeling, especially if it's a brief blackout. But why he would have done that makes no sense. So, yeah, it's very, very hard to still to this day to be absolutely certain of what's going on. But let's say if you apply Occam's razor to it, you can simplify quite a bit all the stuff that was going on.
Yeah, the main feeling from people kind of outside McLaren engineers that looked at it, there was some GPS data, is that basically Alonso lost it. He went a bit quicker through turn 3 than he'd been before. He got wide over the curb onto the AstroTurf, lost the car. This whole theory that he maybe blacked out before he hit the wall or had some problem doesn't really tally with the fact he managed to brake and downshift. That bit of his memory seems to tally with the data. It seems like there must have been something weird that happened to the car that he went off in the way that he did. And I think the best theory, and Ron Dennis did kind of support this at the time, is that he hit the wall at a kind of side-on angle. And of course, all the kind of safety devices, hands and etc., were developed for head-on impacts and to try to mitigate problems in that scenario. And Alonso, I think, went almost flush into the wall and effectively had like a sideways whiplash of the head. And that's the best working theory in terms of how the concussion was caused. But as Ed said, everything was just so hazy because it was an old school test. There wasn't the live coverage you have now. TV cameras were basically not there. They were in the pit lane if they were there at all. And you just had not really any eyewitnesses of the one main eyewitness having a fuzzy memory because he basically had a concussion, and they were protecting him, I think, by making him miss races and whatnot. It seemed to be at the upper end of kind of seriousness. And they were playing it safe by saying, look, you know, if you come back too soon, and as Ed says, if you have a secondary concussion, you could be in big trouble. So within all this kind of mystery and Alonso not remembering and McLaren not wanting to say anything, we just had the most nonsense things filling the gap. And as a journalist, you had to work through all that because you had other members of the media cohort saying, the drivers don't want to race with him, he's going to be unsafe, he can't have his license back. And this was going on right up even until the Thursday before the cars were due to hit the track in Malaysia. So there was still always this sense of like, what actually is going to happen? What is Alonso going to be like? And of course, when he actually hit the track, it was, he's absolutely fine. And then everything was forgotten.
Yeah, and I think if you're to look at it, most likely it was a normal crash. The one thing that you start to ask about is that claim from Alonso that it's a steering problem. And it's not impossible because having all sorts of problems at that time, McLaren, that there was maybe some resistance because the hydraulics had some interruption or just something just temporarily happened that may not have shown up in the data that made him feel like it had completely locked. Maybe it was just more resistance or something. So I think it was just one of those normal things. But yeah, the fact there was so much going around, I think this has kind of become fact now forever. It remains a bit of a mystery. And as is quite often the case with mysteries, normally the boring, predictable answer that it was just man puts a Formula One car into a wall, which sometimes does happen, and the wall's quite hard. Yes, yeah. Exactly. That happens. So, I'm sure you will continue to see speculation about this forever. But all you can do as a journalist is go with what evidence you've got. I think we can rule out any kind of electrical problem, electrocution or that kind of thing related to this. There seems to be zero evidence for that. Could have been interruption in the steering or something that he was trying to correct. But yeah, it was just one of those things. And it's a good lesson in why it's important for teams to be accurate and precise with what they're talking about in terms of the sorts of injuries that happen, because otherwise you get all this nonsense.
I'm glad you said electrocution there, because I was going to say earlier, Ron Dennis meant electrocution, didn't he? Not electrification.
I think so.
He wasn't predicting the next 10 years of the automotive industry, was he?
No, it was a Ronism, which essentially referred to the idea that Alonso had suffered an electric shock. And that's why it stood out in my memory, because like even in that situation, Ron was able to invent some language that was kind of appropriate, but just wasn't completely made up.
Yeah, didn't help. I remember you talked about all the speculation in the paddock and all of that. I knew someone at the time who worked on the shop floor at McLaren, I think, and I remember them saying that this speculation was rampant in the rank and file at the team as well back in Woking, and I remember the theory he told me. I've never put this out there before, but it's 10 years ago. I'm sure people don't care now. He said that the main rumour he heard in McLaren was that Alonso's seatbelts failed in some way. And he was never sure if that was before the accident or during, or if that was what led to like the strange head impact or anything like that. But again, like these wild theories weren't just people on the outside looking in. There were lots of regular people in McLaren who didn't know either.
Yeah, that was one of the theories. But again, because the team was so guarded about, well, they didn't reveal any of data they did have in terms of what happened in the crash. They were contradicting themselves, like I say. What I don't really understand, I think probably what would happen now, especially with coverage being so much greater, is why they didn't just sit down and do a proper debrief, like get Alonso, elements of the team, and just explain it as best they could all together, get on the same page, and then just move on from it. But they sort of seemed to try to do blanket no coverage when the accident happened, and then kind of drip feed bits out as the conspiracy theories established, because of course a lot of publishing was not very rigorous, and people would just put their theories out there and commit them to web. So you'd have McLaren basically becoming reactive and seeing all these crazy things pop up, whether it was, you know, some internal rumours like seatbelts, or whether it was this kind of electrification that Ron referred to. And they were having to kind of whack-a-mole it and jump on each thing and say, oh no, that didn't happen, this happened. And I think they could have controlled the message, as Ed put it, a lot better if they'd just gone, right, okay, we know Alonso's fine now, we're going to sit down at this point and we're going to have, if Ron wants to be there, he can. We're going to have Ron, Eric Boullier and Fernando, and we're just going to explain as best we can, and also explain the limitations in why we can't explain it more fully.
McLaren and Alonso continued to not be quite on the same page once practice started. So Ben's seen Alonso from trackside and he goes, oh yeah, he's fine. He hasn't driven off the track again.
No.
But McLaren racing director Eric Boullier, who we've already mentioned, declared Alonso was at 100% from the first moment and that he was exactly as he was before. Alonso disagreed with that, saying that he felt great in the car and enjoyed being back. But he added, I am not 100% physically fit after 2 weeks not in the car. After gym, simulator, whatever you do, it's never the same as when you drive the car. Ed, we've outlined our view that McLaren kind of made a mess of trying to deal with this. Were they just trying too hard by this point, once Fernando's back? Are they just trying too hard to take every opportunity to go, no, everything's fine, everything's back to normal, everybody move on? It felt like they couldn't resist digging themselves into holes.
Yeah, it comes out to that communication point, doesn't it? If they're constantly saying everything's fine, everything's perfect, everything's brilliant, people start to say, wait a minute, why are they saying that? If I start saying this podcast's going really well, everything's been absolutely perfect, no problems at all, really good, no. Yeah, perfect, bring back V10s. Everyone listening is going to say, wait a minute. So I think
there's no V10s.
Exactly, and
yeah,
even
not the perfect episode at all.
That's true. Yeah, even that evidence, that thing you cited about Alonso saying he wasn't 100% fit, wasn't 100% fit, and Boullier saying he was. They're kind of saying very fractionally different things, because Boullier saying, yeah, he's recovered from everything, he's normal. Alonso's just saying, well, my fitness regime's just had a little bit of a knock to it, so I'm not quite at 100% normal peak conditioning, if you like. So even then, there's just that little bit of a disconnect. And I presume some of it stems from the fact McLaren wanted to scotch the idea anything may have gone wrong with the car, and Alonso was convinced that it had. So there was that disconnect that I think also lay at the heart of it, in that Alonso wanted to say, yeah, something did go wrong. The team wanted to say, yeah, it was the driver's, basically by implication, the driver's mistake or a gust of wind or whatever. So yeah, it was just an ongoing mess. And every time anyone said anything, it caused some other contradiction to come up. So it's, yeah, just a brilliant example of just saying things, stoking the fire, no matter what you say.
I suspect Alonso revelled in it a bit too, because he loves a wind-up, and McLaren were giving him basically an open goal by not even getting their own messaging straight, so he could just fit into these gaps and say, well, I think this happened actually. And there was no real way for them to contradict him properly because they'd already lost all their credibility by not getting their own story straight.
I think it's just a good example of Ron Dennis perhaps ideally not getting involved in that sort of thing, because all that concussion symptoms but not concussion, and it all comes back to that not understanding what concussion is, and it is serious. And I think even if they were conservative keeping him out of the car in Australia, it made a lot of sense because the car failed before the race even started in Australia, so that wasn't great use for standing Kevin Magnussen. But you don't take chances with this sort of thing. It's better to be safe than sorry, especially when there's nothing really to play for.
I think that's another reason why Alonso made the comment he did about physical fitness, because if you remember, the testing was absolutely awful. They did hardly any laps. Then he missed a race. So he just wouldn't have had the in-car fitness, never mind the training fitness that was interrupted by his recovery.
And like Ed said, they're probably saying slightly different things. Boulier probably meant he's fine, like there's no obvious ill effects. But that comes across as it's just the wording you use then allows somebody to ask Fernando, are you 100%? And he can go, well, in terms of this way, no, I'm not. And then we've got the two contrasting views when actually they might roughly mean the same thing. I do also wonder, I think, as you said there, Ed, I wonder how much of the tailspin McLaren got into over this was actually down to perhaps the damage done by Ron's attempts to control the message himself in the immediate aftermath. I think in testing, I'm sure Ron was at that test trying.
It was in Barcelona. They went to I think there was one more day, and he came to the final day and did a kind of big sit down to get on top of everything.
Well, that's it.
Just created more mess.
Yeah, he probably thought, I'll go there, I'll hold court for 20 minutes, and that will simmer everything down. And kind of the world and media coverage have moved on by that point, and actually everything you say gets picked apart rather than just parroted. And that's what caused them all the problems, and then they just couldn't get back on top of it after that. So we've mentioned already that McLaren were quite good at digging themselves into holes during this period, and they did that again, I feel, after the first day of practice, talking up the incredible rate of progress since their disastrous pre-season and forgettable first race of the new Honda era in Australia. Alonso called the first day in Malaysia a big step forward, saying the team had gained 1.5 seconds in 2 weeks, and he was pleased to get through 45 laps of running without any problems, as in testing he'd never been able to do more than 4 or 5 laps before having to stop. Teammate Jenson Button joined in, saying that McLaren's progress might not have looked as impressive from the outside because we are so far behind that you won't see a position change, but he said McLaren had found a good chunk in terms of performance. Button said it was not only coming from more engine power, but also better cooling and aero updates, all of which was gaining lap time for McLaren. Ed, we'll come back to McLaren at the end of this weekend as well, but at this stage, was it a fair point that because things had started so badly, McLaren was making actually quite a big amount of progress in this early part of 2015, just from one race to the next?
Well, yeah, they were making progress, but it was just from such a low starting point. They were so far behind with the whole thing, on the Honda side and the problems they were having, that it just meant it was a kind of complete mess, really. And you're at the point where a big improvement is being able to run uninterrupted for something approaching a normal length of time. So, yeah, I mean, they were playing catch-up, but they were playing catch-up the whole season. So, yeah, it's like percentage growth, isn't it? You can look at percentage growth numbers and they look great, but if the base number is really, really low, it's like, well, that's not quite as impressive as a lower growth number for a higher thing in terms of actual gains. So, yeah, fine, but yeah, you've got a very, very long way to go.
They were basically moving from completely embarrassing to slightly less embarrassing at this point, and I think getting a bit overexcited by it. I remember doing an interview with Arai-san, who at that point was running the Honda F1 engine program. At the final test of 2014, they debuted the new Honda engine, and they were quite excited about it, and it couldn't run. It just didn't work. And he was explaining that they felt really confident about the hybrid side, that they would be able to really crack that, and they they just couldn't do it. And I think you were at the first test of 2015 with us, Glenn, in Jerez, and they were seconds off. Like, not only could they not do many laps, like you say, maybe 4 or so in a row by that point, they were like 6 or more seconds off the pace. It was absolutely woeful. And the only reason I think they got away with it to some extent early in the season is because there was one team on the grid that was even more embarrassing.
Yeah, we'll talk about them later.
Manor-Russia, who couldn't even run their cars at all and get them out the garage, never mind do laps. So, yeah, I mean, for what McLaren set out to do at this point, it was absolutely awful. I think they were just clinging to hope at this point and just trying to paint as positive a picture as they could.
And remember, Honda was still saying quite close to the end of the 2014 season they expected to come in and be challenging Mercedes, basically in terms of the engine quality. I remember Arai-san saying, I think it's Suzuka in a press conference, which would have been the previous October. Yeah, that's still our objective. And they were miles off it. So it tells you about how everyone was underestimating. And it wasn't just Honda, as future events will to this will show. McLaren wasn't perfect in the way it was doing things either. So yeah, and it just made them be in a massive hole, and just all they wanted to do is just say, well, look, we are actually making progress, just to show that they were, but it wasn't progress that was going to lead anywhere.
And this partnership had been talked up from the moment it was announced. When was it announced? Was it 2013 sometime? From the
Goodwood, wasn't it?
The moment they came together, all the talk was, this is going to be McLaren-Honda, the Senna Prost era part 2. We're gonna dominate, and it, so expectations were through the roof, and then you're not just under delivering, you're not even in the same stratosphere as the expectations you've set.
Yeah, it was announced a bit before Goodwood, the actual press conference in Tokyo. I know that because I followed the press conference remotely, and I interviewed Arai-san at Goodwood, so that must have been after. So it's at some point.
That's what I remember
in 2013.
Honda's sluggish start then to its F1 return raised questions about if it would have benefited from supplying more than one team, so it had more data to work with. But Honda's F1 boss, Yasuhisa Arai, who we've just mentioned, believed staying focused on McLaren would be enough. He said Honda had enough data to develop in a good direction, and if we supplied another team to get more data, that data would make no difference to us, as a team of McLaren's calibre with 2 world champion drivers gave Honda all the feedback it needed. He described the troubleshooting of the early months of 2015 as like a pop-up game in the arcade. This is going to be our second mention. I assume he means whack-a-mole, which you've already heard once in this episode. And he said a lot of the problems Honda encountered were unexpected. However, when asked if that originally stated target of winning a race in 2015 was going to be revised, Arai said, "We don't change our targets. Winning this year is the aim." Ben, I'm not going to ask you to pass comment on that target nonsense, but do you think I remember you followed the McLaren-Honda saga very closely in your years as an F1 full-time correspondent. At the beginning, do you think Honda would have benefited from having another team alongside McLaren?
At the time, I kind of bought this argument that they just needed to focus on what they were doing. But I think in retrospect, it would have helped. And the main reason is, although they would have been stretched, it felt like at the time they were overstretched. They underestimated the challenge. They needed just to focus on doing the basics rather than, doing 4 engines instead of 2. But the way Arai-san was talking in that excerpt you mentioned, it just feels like Ron Dennis is hanging over his shoulder. This was all kind of driven by Ron. Ron wanted the Works engine deal. Ron didn't want to be with Mercedes anymore. Ron made 2014 more difficult for McLaren by pre-announcing his Honda deal and then basically saying, we're not going to stay with you anymore. Ron wanted it to be a return to the absolute domination, which I think is the phrase he used before the season started with Honda that everyone remembered from 1988. Ron wanted the size 0 packaging on the McLaren car that was supposed to give them this massive aero advantage, and that really boxed Honda into a corner. Like most of not all of their problems, but a big chunk of their problems were didn't have any physical room to do stuff to the engine. And eventually they got to the point where they started to push back against that. But at this point, they're very much trying to protect their partnership with McLaren and stay on the same page as them. And I feel like if they'd had the second team from the start and been able to do that or force that through, that team wouldn't have had the same size 0 packaging just for one, and they would have been able to see how their engine performed in a different layout, and that might just have led McLaren to see through their own hubris a bit earlier than they did. But it was never going to happen because at this point Red Bull are falling out with Renault quite badly, which I'm sure we'll get onto. And there was even talk at one stage of them, looking for a Honda engine, and Ron had an exclusivity clause. He definitely didn't want Red Bull to be part of that family, but I don't think he wanted anyone. He wanted it all for himself. So it was never a consideration. And I felt really throughout this whole period, what Honda wanted or needed was never really at the top of McLaren's priority list.
Yeah, Ron wanted to recreate the glory days of the first partnership, but I remember someone at the time telling me he turned down a proposal for a red and white livery. Because obviously at the start of the season, they kept the silver, didn't they? And I remember Ed was particularly wound up about that, going, why is this car still silver? It's not got the Mercedes thing anymore. But they soon changed that. But they went for black instead of white. Anyway, let's move on from McLaren. We spent a long time talking about them, and we're going to talk about them again at the end.